I know it's not Halloween, but I have a very spooky subject to cover today at the request of some very curious students. And you know what they say about curiosity? Ha ha ha. It's an all new Prove It To Me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law. I'm going to do something a little bit different with this Study Finds episode. This isn't something I found on the news or in an article somewhere. This is sort of a special request. You see, I have a graduate level ethics class that I am currently co teaching. It's fun, it's dynamic, and it inevitably challenges the way students think about certain situations and how they manage workplace safety. It's also challenging for me because a lot of ethical debates live in this realm of uncertainty. There isn't a lot of data, no way to quantify the impact of certain approaches and issues within ethics. Sometimes it feels like fluff, even though the conversations are extremely valuable and absolutely necessary for the work we do as safety practitioners. But for me, as a quantitative researcher, sometimes I'm uncomfortable living in that realm of uncertainty. Anyway, there's this part of the course where we discuss the macabre. I do love this section because it always sparks debate and challenges the way students think, but it's also something I consider to be a huge plague to our profession. Okay, macabre, what the hell are you talking about, Dr. Law? I'm sure most folks listening right now have sat through some kind of safety training in their careers. In fact, because of the nature of this podcast and the listenership, many of you have probably delivered safety training to your workers. There's this really insanely popular way to get the point across during safety training that involves using graphic imagery or videos, the kind with blood and guts and uncomfortable situations that are used to scare our workers into behaving a certain way. We couple this macabre imagery with language like, "Don't let this happen to you," or "This is what happens when you don't follow the rules." They're all gross, and the worst are the ones that actually show fatalities. Someone got killed in that video. Now, there is a huge discussion about ethics to be had around the use of macabre imagery, and it's multifaceted. First, we have the topic of psychological safety. Will the folks on the receiving end of graphic imagery and videos experience any negative feelings after viewing the imagery? Could trauma be induced? Could it exacerbate the underlying issues such as post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD? Now, don't start with me about how your workers are in construction or heavy manufacturing, and these are tough guys, and if they can't handle that, they shouldn't be doing this kind of work. Look, I've been in the military for 15 years and counting. I've seen the toughest and the strongest, and I've seen them get taken down by the smallest things that affect their mental health. Does it make them less tough? No. Trauma is real, and it causes real, serious, long-term effects. And you can't pretend to know how anyone is feeling or how they will be affected by certain things. Second, where does this imagery come from? Do we own it? Was consent given by the injured, the deceased, or their families to use this imagery for training purposes? How do the families feel about their dead loved ones being put on display for all of us to see? Was consent given by the organization where the incident occurred? Or did someone take a cell phone video while watching surveillance recordings, then post it on social media? Yeah, that one's not only unethical, it's illegal. Third, what kind of light does this shine on the people involved? You see, since I don't do a ton of training for workers or sit through much safety training myself in my current roles, I get to see these images and videos posted on social media platforms like LinkedIn, the acclaimed social media network for supposed professionals. This is a great opportunity for a study on the current state of the safety profession. Just jump to the comments section. I guarantee you'll find a bunch of so-called safety professionals talking about how stupid the person was who got hurt or killed in whatever image or video got posted. You'll have entire comment sections trying to do a full-on investigation or root cause analysis from 30 seconds of video. Like, seriously? This is why I hold so much cynicism for our current state of affairs. Is that how they do their jobs? No wonder we can't move the needle on workplace safety. On top of that, these things get posted as, quote, safety fails, creating a mockery of people involved in incidents or unsafe situations. They are designed to blame the people shown for the unsafe situation we see. But the real buffoonery is in the self proclaimed safety professionals who post and comment on this stuff thinking they're doing anything to help the situation. So that's the ethical discussion, and there's a lot more to be said about it, but one of my favorite things to do is bring quantitative data into that part of the discussion. I don't do it right away. I like to let the students stew and theorize over the do's and don'ts before I bring the hammer down. You see, there's a reason we started using the macabre in our safety training. It's a scare tactic, and scare tactics are used to change behavior. Now, when I teach safety to safety professionals, I spend little time in behavioral based safety. I spend more time on system safety, discussing the organizational and physical mechanisms we can put into place to control hazards, reduce risk, and avoid human error entirely. Humans are humans and do human things, so the dependence on behavior entirely is just not the most reliable way to ensure safety. When, and I mean when, humans do fail, we want them to be able to fail safely. However, I do have a strong and lengthy background in behavioral science. Yes, strong and lengthy. I've performed a ton of behavioral research, and I consider behavioral science to be one of my core skill sets. So naturally, I have data to present when we talk about things that affect behaviors. So here's how the conversation went most recently. I said, so how long do you think scare tactics actually affect behavior after they are used? The students give their best guesses and go back and forth for a minute or so. Finally, I dig into my data bank, meaning just what's sitting in my memory from the research I've done in the past. I puff out my chest, hold my head high, and I say, it's 30 to 60 days. Now, for a good half a minute, there are eyes that open wide, murmurings and such, and I finish my thought by saying, yes, compared to other factors that affect behavior, such as positive reinforcement, scare tactics have a much shorter lifespan in their ability to affect behavioral change. I'm always super proud of my ability to cut through the theorizing and contemplating at this point because I just presented facts, and now there's no more room left to ponder. This time, though, a student said, Dr. Law, would you be able to provide that research for us? I hesitated. They got me. I mean, I distinctly remember that fact from my research, but I haven't looked at it in years at this point. Could I find it again? Does it still hold up? Is it relevant? Has it been disproven? Yeah, students know how to make me sweat. So finally, I sigh and say, yes, probably. Let me find it and circle back to you. That's what we say, right? Circle back, circle back. We're always circling back, just like we're running laps in life. Circle back. Blah. Then I thought, you know what? This would make a good podcast. I'm going to study fines myself. Did I give the right information or am I full of shit? All right, so here's how this is going to work. Of course, I put my search terms in and I came up with a ton of articles. I was not surprised to find a collection of stuff that supports my claims, but then also a number of studies that conclude that scare tactics work to some degree. I've got two main parts to how I'm going to structure this. First, I'm going to make this a two-part podcast because I care about your time and frankly, I care about my time. In part one, I will present the studies that seem to support the claims I made about scare tactics being less effective than other training methods. In part two, I will present the studies that create the opposing viewpoint. You know, because I'm fair and balanced. But I mean fair and balanced in a way that actually gives a fair shot to both sides rather than heavily leaning to the side that is seemingly opposite of other mainstream sources of information. You get the picture, right? The other part is that I need to make this a rapid fire evaluation of multiple studies. Rather than spending a whole episode talking about one study, I need to give you several in one episode. Think of it like a quasi meta analysis, except this is in no way as thorough as a real meta analysis. I'm going to challenge myself to spend no more than 10 minutes on each study, and I will give you the high points, the intent, the design, the findings, the limitations, and my best opinion on whether it's a good study or not. Cool? Are you ready? I hope so. We got a lot to get through today, so let's get started. Oh, one quick note. In behavioral science research, scare tactics are also referred to as fear appeals or threat appeals, so you'll hear me go back and forth on terms as we go through these studies. Today, I have 4 studies, and I'm going to go in chronological order by publishing date. This first one is by Carey and colleagues and was published in PLOS 1 in 2013. The title is The Impact of Threat Appeals on Fear Arousal and Driver Behavior, a meta-analysis of experimental research 1990 to 2011. This is actually a great place to start because a meta-analysis brings in a whole bunch of research together to try to paint a bigger picture rather than being super hyper-focused on one specific application. I may even cheat and spend a little bit more time here since this will probably give us a bunch of information. Real quick, just so we cover this base, this study was funded by a bursary from the Road Safety Authority of Ireland. The funders had no role in study design, data collection and analysis, decision to publish, or preparation of the manuscript, and the authors have declared that no competing interests exist. On to the study. The authors state, quote, "Threat appeals have been widely utilized in road safety advertising campaigns in an attempt to discourage risky driving and typically present graphic representations of the death and injury that may occur as a result of a road traffic collision." Okay, so this is exactly what we're looking for. Solid. Their goal was to clarify the usefulness of threat appeals by looking at experimental research that has already been conducted, and they state that up to this point, no other meta-analysis has been done to specifically look at the relationship between threat appeals and driving behavior. Now, the authors spend a good page or so talking about previous studies that look at the relationship between threat appeals and behavior and introduce theoretical models. That's great, actually. Good analysis should start with a model. Models help us visualize the relationships between variables, know which variables to measure, and understand which relationships to measure as we gather and analyze data. An important thing to note about models, though, models are not telling you for certain that relationships exist. They might be created based on preliminary research that established those relationships, but they are not intended to tell you that it will always work that way. They are basically a map that guides you towards the things you want to measure as you do the research. So don't ever let somebody hand you a theoretical or conceptual model and tell you that this is the way things are. That's not how models work. One important model that the authors discussed is the extended parallel process model. I found this model and I'll include a couple of links in the episode notes so that you can see what I'm talking about. Let me walk you through it because the way this is presented might actually inform how we look at the other studies as well. Basically, this model seeks to show relationships between variables that help determine if a fear appeal or a threat appeal will result in a positive behavior change, if it will be rejected, or even if it may exacerbate the problem. If the person receiving the message thinks the threat is not severe enough, or they think they are not susceptible enough to the threat, the message is rejected. If the message has a high enough threat appraisal in terms of severity and susceptibility, we move on to the efficacy appraisal. Efficacy is also divided into 2 parts. Response efficacy, which assesses whether the person receiving the message believes the recommended behavior will prevent or reduce the threat, and self-efficacy, which assesses whether the person receiving the message believes they are capable of doing the recommended behavior. Again, if the efficacy appraisal is low, the message is rejected. But not only that, the message has already induced fear. So not only have you not changed the behavior, you have also scared them shitless, and that's where the exacerbation can occur. We're only making the problem worse. Finally, if both the threat appraisal and the efficacy appraisal are high, then we get the behavior change we intended. One of the links I'm including will show you the model, another will show a matrix similar to a risk matrix, so pick your poison on how to best digest this information. Now, the reason I feel it's so necessary to dig into this model specifically is because of that efficacy piece. I think we are going to see that quite a bit in these studies. If we do want to scare the shit out of people with graphic imagery and videos, they also need to feel like they have the ability to do what we want them to do. What affects efficacy? Lots of things. The environment around a person, what others are doing, what they think others will think of them, the tools available, historical knowledge, all sorts of things. Are you starting to see why behavioral based safety can get a little challenging to try to accomplish? The authors say this about what they found in the literature that helped them build the background to this study. Quote, key points to emerge from these models and from existent empirical research in general is that the underlying psychological mechanisms at play in the fear to behavior relationship are likely to be complex and do not always involve direct causation. Rather, there are likely to be moderators and mediators of this relationship, and a key task for researchers and advertisers is to identify and better understand these factors. Dr. Law, what are moderators and mediators? I'm glad you asked. Moderators, or moderating factors, affect the relationship between variables. For example, if I want to figure out how different dish soaps affect grease, the way those dish soaps affect the grease might be impacted by the type of material of which the dish is made. The dish material is the moderator to that relationship. A mediator, or a mediating factor, lies on the causal pathway of that relationship, and it's also directly affected by the independent variable. I'll have to use a different example for this. The amount of sleep I get might affect how much work I get done the next day. In fact, the amount of sleep I get affects my alertness, which in turn affects how much work I get done. Alertness here is the mediator. In the model we just talked about, you could say that efficacy is a mediator between a threat appeal and the desired behavior. In fact, I believe we might see some studies that explore that exact relationship. Okay, I see my clock is ticking, so let's dig into the rest of this study. In a meta-analysis, you treat articles as your participants when it comes to creating a valid sample. With that, you have exclusion criteria. So the authors started with 54 articles. They excluded 16 of the initial list because they didn't have a control group or didn't control confounding factors. They truly wanted experimental studies. They excluded another 15 because those studies did not provide statistics to compute effect sizes. Then they excluded another 10 to end up with only 13 that looked at the difference in behavior between participants exposed to threat appeals and those in a control group. The total sample size of participants across these 13 studies was 3,044. So what did they find? 4 of these studies measured fear as an outcome, total sample size of 619. They found that threat appeals had a statistically significant effect on fear arousal compared to control groups. In other words, scare tactics statistically significantly scare the shit out of people. Next, they looked at the overall effect of threat appeals on driving behavior. I'm going to read this verbatim. Quote, no significant effect of threat appeals on the driving outcome variables emerged. When we examined each outcome variable separately, we found no significant difference between threat appeal and control groups on self-reported intention to take driving risks or in driving simulator speed or speed during a video speed test. They continued, quote, studies using a video-based manipulation produced particularly strong effects on fear with no effect on driving behavior or intentions. Bottom line, we scared the shit out of them, but it didn't work. So let me talk through limitations to this study. There are some that the authors talk about, but some that I observed as well. First, only 4 of the 13 studies measured fear, not just the behavior outcomes. If we go back to that extended parallel process model, both fear and efficacy are potential mediating factors. Without both of these things, according to the model, a behavior change might not happen. With only fear, we could make the problem worse. The other part to this is that fear was measured by self-reporting, meaning that the participants rated on a scale how scared they were after being exposed to the scare tactic. There are other ways to measure fear, such as heart rate, skin conductance, etc., that were not used in any of these studies. Also, other emotions such as guilt, shame, and anger were not measured. Previous research shows that these emotions interplay with fear and could determine the effectiveness of the threat appeal. Also, as much as efficacy was discussed, it was also not measured. Lastly, for me, we did not observe actual driving behaviors. We measured self-reports of behaviors, and we observed simulated driving. Folks, I have to say that my behaviors in the popular video game Grand Theft Auto do not reflect my behaviors in real life. Even so, we have this study that concludes that while previous research suggests threat-based messaging can be effective under the right conditions, there is little evidence to suggest that it consistently works. Everybody still with me? Okay, next study. I have Brooks and Harvey, who published a study in Social Semiotics in 2015 titled Peddling a Semiotics of Fear, a critical examination of scare tactics and commercial strategies in public health promotion. Just as a side note, I had to Google the word semiotics. From Wikipedia, which I am personally deeming perfectly acceptable in the cases where my vocabulary is challenged, semiotics is the systematic study of sign processes and the communication of meaning. In semiotics, a sign is defined as anything that communicates intentional and unintentional meaning or feelings to the sign's interpreter. Okie doke. So we're looking at how messages are interpreted by the receiver. I'm with you. I just needed a minute to get my vocabulary straight. Looks like both of these authors worked at the University of Nottingham in the UK, the first as a doctoral researcher in health communication and the second as a lecturer in sociolinguistics. These folks basically looked at scare tactics used in a nationwide health promotion campaign in the UK aimed at raising the public's awareness of type 2 diabetes. Now, personally, I love diabetes research. Mostly, I love it because there is a ton of it, and any kind of specific function or intervention that exists for general public health initiatives has almost certainly been both applied and researched for type 2 diabetes. We still haven't fixed it, but we've researched the hell out of it, and I'm here for the data. It looks like the intent of this campaign was to advocate personal responsibility for assessing both individual and others' risk of type 2 diabetes. The authors separated out 3 different messaging techniques used in the campaign. First, the depiction of grief and amplification of diabetes-related danger. Second, the promotion of diabetes risk and localization of individuals' responsibility for their health. And third, the commercial branding and framing of this Diabetes UK and Tesco partnership, the folks putting on this campaign. Diabetes UK is a diabetes charity, and Tesco is a British supermarket chain. The branding and framing of the partnership included promotion of goods and services as a means of diabetes prevention and management. So this study is a critical multimodal discourse analysis. They analyzed the communication in this campaign, examining how the different pieces convey meaning and ideology. This is not my forte. I'm going to make up some time here because I can't critically evaluate this with my own knowledge and skill set. I'd love to bring a guest on eventually to discuss this with me, but frankly, I don't have a whole lot to offer you on this one. In fact, the nature of this study is not particularly useful to me because there are no numbers. There's no data. Critically analyzing meaning? This isn't experimental at all. We're just creating an argument. So what is the argument? I'm jumping down to the discussion because the analysis itself is meaty. You're welcome to follow the resource in my episode notes if you have access and you like this type of study. Personally, it's not for me, but I'm not going to knock it. After all, Wikipedia says the semiotics thing is in fact science, right? I'm going to pull this part here because I think we can still spark some thought. Quote, this prominent campaign emphasizes the dangerous and potentially fatal consequences of individuals not taking responsibility for personally assessing and responding to their and their family's risk of diabetes, whether they are actually at risk of contracting the disease or not. Consequently, the campaign presents, we argue, only a partial picture of both diabetes and the actual lived experiences of people who have the condition. This portrayal obscures the reality of diabetes as a disease, which, although can indeed have various serious long-term biological consequences, people are able to manage successfully, living full and long lives. Thus, the campaign mirrors the somewhat sensationalist way in which some quarters of the media report illnesses, with a strong focus on the debilitating and fatal aspects of the disease at the expense of reporting how people actually live with and overcome the effects of illnesses. Ah, I see. This actually takes us back into the ethical discussion, but from a slightly different perspective. The authors are taking issue with the fact that the campaign images did not reflect reality. The question they are asking is, what is the point of scaring people if the outcome portrayed does not accurately reflect the likely experienced outcome and if the interpretation of meaning is in question? Let me put it another way. Does the macabre imagery we use in safety training accurately depict the outcome we can expect? what is the likelihood that that exact scenario would happen again? If workers are able to work around the hazards depicted and never experience the injuries depicted in the graphic imagery, does it convolute how meaning is derived from the imagery? I think these are interesting questions, but not necessarily getting me the data I was looking for. Let's get back into some real data, shall we? That's what we're all here for anyway. This next study by Turkel and colleagues was published in 2020 in a journal that I cannot pronounce, but thanks to Google Translate, I can tell you it is the Turkish Journal of Communication Research. The title of the study is Use of Fear Appeal in Work Safety Messages, an Experimental Study. Finally, we've got a study that looks at this stuff in workplace safety. Perfect. I'm glad everyone has stuck with me so far, so let's dig in. This study comes from the Izmir University of Economics. It looks like this article was adapted from the master's thesis of the third author, and the two lead authors are the students' professors. Oof. I guess that's how they do it in Turkey. Still, at least they've got this. I still haven't turned my doctoral study into a published article. One day, I guess. This study sought to compare attitudes, perceived ethicality, fear emotions, and behavioral intention of workers when exposed to a stimulus containing the threat of physical injury message compared to a stimulus without such a message. Now, a lot of the background here about fear appeals is very similar to what we talked about in the first article. To no surprise, the extended parallel process model is discussed, along with some other theoretical approaches, including drive theories, the parallel response model, and protection motivation theory. I'm getting the sense here that the extended parallel process model is the latest and greatest and seems to be highly regarded. I'm going to jump down to hypotheses. I'm excited because so far on this podcast, I don't know if I have yet shared a study with real, well-written hypotheses. You ready? Here we go. H1. That means first hypothesis. Workers' responses will differ on attitude towards the message when exposed to a stimulus containing a threat of injury message compared to one without any threat of an injury message. H2. Workers' responses will differ on perceived ethicality when exposed to a stimulus containing a threat of an injury message compared to one without any threat of an injury message. See the pattern? Workers' responses will differ on X when exposed to a stimulus. It's repetitive, sure, but it makes this contained, consistent, and measurable. We are only changing the dependent variable in the hypothesis. So, H1 is attitude towards the message, H2 is perceived ethicality, H3 is fear emotions, and H4 is behavioral intention in work safety. Folks, you don't even know. I am in my happy space. This is what I expect from good research. Give me more. Come on. So let's look at methodology. The authors used a print advertisement from WorkSafe Victoria and modified it into two different versions for the study, one that has graphic imagery and one that doesn't. The message in Turkish says, quote, "Before it's too late, in Turkey, 661 work accidents occur every day. Don't let one of them be you. Take precautions," end quote. If you open up this article, the images are in the appendix, and I had a little laugh out loud moment. It's the same image of this guy sitting at a table looking super serious. In one image, he has no hand. Instead, he has a stub of a forearm and obviously lost his hand in some kind of gnarly accident. In the second image, his hand has been photoshopped back on, I'm guessing. At first glance, maybe you wouldn't think that he didn't originally have a hand in this photo, so I guess it works. It just made me laugh, but I have a weird sense of humor. They actually did some good work to get rid of confounding factors. For example, they ran a pilot to determine what type of logo to use, making sure the logo itself did not elicit any positive or negative feelings. They also ran a chi-square test of independence to ensure fatalism tendency and self-efficacy were matched between the two groups, noting that both of these affect behavioral intention and that work accidents happen more frequently in firms where workers have higher levels of fatalistic beliefs about work accidents. That's probably a study for another time. They also ran a pilot to analyze items, assess internal consistency, and stability of measures. Heyo! Statistical validation of the instrument. Love it. So they had a total of 300 participants, which is pretty solid, although it was a convenience sample, but that's not surprising for a master's thesis. Frankly, it's impressive that this type of research was even done for a graduate level degree. Anyway, split the sample into two groups. One gets the advertisement featuring the guy with the stub, and the other gets the guy with a hand. Remember, everything else is the same, including the message. What did they find? Well, the group that got the guy with the hand statistically significantly had more positive feelings toward the advertisement, and they also felt it was more ethical. Here's the kicker: no statistically significant differences in fear emotion or behavioral intentions between the two groups. Now, to be fair, the reason it's good to dig into this one is because there are some limitations and maybe some additional things we can infer knowing what we know from other things we've looked at. First, obviously, what we found here is that showing the guy with the stub was unnecessary for the message. We get basically the same behavioral intention if we just show the guy with his whole hand. Second, there was no difference in fear emotion between the groups. It's not really clear here, but it's possible neither of the groups were scared enough at all. Remember, if we go back to our favorite extended parallel process model, we need both fear and efficacy to create behavior change. Also, since the level of behavioral intention is also not clear, we don't know for sure if this advertisement made any difference at all in behavior, whether the guy had a hand in the photo or not. The authors fairly bring up the fact that more research needs to be done on different types of media, such as video. Then you've got your normal limitations like the fact that this was a convenient sample and all of the results were self-reported by the participants rather than being observed objectively. Overall, what I'm taking from this study is that it was performed at the level of thoroughness and rigidity that I expect from good research. And graphic images can affect positive and negative feelings and continue to bring up questions of ethicality, but overall, were unnecessary to create behavior change in this instance. Okay, are you ready for the next study? Do you need a break? Just push the damn pause button on the podcast. It's the one with the two vertical lines. I'm not responsible for your breaks. Sheesh. When you come back, push the button with the sideways triangle. Here we go. Last study I have for today. This study by Kohler and colleagues was published in BMC Public Health in 2022, and it's titled Change of Risk Behavior in Young People: The Effectiveness of the Trauma Prevention Program PARTY, or PARTY, Considering the Effect of Fear Appeals and Cognitive Processes. That's a long-ass title. This one is open access, so you can read this whole thing using the link in the episode notes. This study was conducted in Germany. Open access publishing was funded by Project Deal. One of the authors was involved in the implementation of the PARTY program, and another is employed in the research department of Project Deal. Aside from that, no competing interests, and the study was reviewed for ethical approval by Bielefeld University. So, the purpose of this study was to examine the effectiveness of the Injury Awareness and Prevention Program PARTY, which stands for Prevent Alcohol and Risk-Related Trauma in Youth in Germany. What this program does, it's a one-day injury awareness and prevention program for youth. A school class will spend a day in a trauma hospital experiencing the various wards through which a seriously injured person goes. Brutal. Apparently, they've been doing this in Canada for more than 30 years. It's also been used in Australia, New Zealand, and the US. So how does this work? The students get 2 half-hour lectures on trauma and prevention, usually held by a trauma surgeon for the trauma part and a police officer for the prevention part. Then they take the students through the individual wards: the ambulance, the trauma room, the intensive care unit, and the normal ward. They are guided by a medical or nursing hospital staff member. Sometimes the students can talk to the patients there if it's possible. They also visit physiotherapy to get an idea of how tedious and difficult rehabilitation can be after a serious injury. Finally, there is a 20-minute talk with a former serious injured patient, and they end with a joint reflection on the day. Gonna be honest, this sounds a lot like some workplace safety trainings I've seen, especially the part where we hear a story from somebody who got injured on the job. Now, since this type of program has existed for quite a while, it has been studied before. Previous research found short-term effects, 1 to 2 weeks, on knowledge and attitudes. That's not very long. They've also found medium-term effects, 6 to 12 months, on self-reported risk behavior. There's that self-reported thing again. Of course I'm being safe, Dad. And they've apparently found long-term effects, up to 44 months, on traffic offenses, injuries, and deaths. So, this study specifically wanted to look at the fear appeals of the program and measure its effectiveness on risk behavior in traffic, and to look at how the fear appeals affect beliefs. They noted that there are a lot of complications here, bringing up again the extended parallel process model, efficacy and behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs associated with the theory of planned behavior. So, what are all of those? Behavioral beliefs are attitude results from previous experience with a behavior, whether they be positive or negative. Normative beliefs are the perceived pressures to comply with the expectations from other people. See, I told you that would come up. Control beliefs are how a person perceives they can actually execute a behavior. Again, getting into that efficacy piece. Okay, methods. How did they do this study? They looked at 19 party day intervention classes among 12 schools and 7 different trauma centers. They used 11 control classes, classes that didn't do a party day. Apparently, some of the schools weren't able to provide a control class, so that's why they have less in that group. And they did a pre-post test design. That means they tested each class before the intervention and after the intervention. They tested a total of 574 students, including 300 that did the intervention and 244 who did not. Now, as far as the measurements and statistical tests, this study is actually very in depth. They measured a bunch of different relationships between a bunch of different variables, including intention, threat, susceptibility, severity, self efficacy, and behaviors. They covered all the bases here, and I don't have time to go through everything, and you probably don't want me to. Like I said, this one is open access, so you're free to take a look and dig deeper if you want. I will say the pretest shows that all participants were on the same level demographically and on their willingness to take risks. So we've got a good baseline. Let me just read a few excerpts from the results summary so we can get what we're trying to find. The authors say, quote, "The results show that the intervention does not directly increase feelings of threat. However, the program obviously affected a theoretical determinant of the threat, namely the perceived severity whose change is directly related to a change in approved behavior. Nevertheless, in turn, it does not increase a person's confidence in his or her ability to counter this threat actively." End quote. Basically, we got across how severe an injury could be, but we didn't change their self-efficacy. And the authors say this provides one possible explanation for why this program does not have the intended effects on behavior. Okay, a few more bullet points. Quote, "Immediately after the intervention, small positive effects could be shown for most of the parameters. These effects could not be observed in the medium term and especially not for self-reported behavior. In other words, we saw a little bit of lift in the intended direction, but we did not measure behavior for a long time after the intervention, so that's why we can't tell you from this study what's happening here." Next, quote, "Both in the short and medium term, the results showed a significant effect only on the threat-related characteristic perceived severity of accidental injuries." Again, we succeeded in showing how bad an injury could be. Finally, quote, "The predictive influence of cognitive beliefs, in particular on a change in behavioral intention, could be confirmed, such as self-efficacy or social norms. However, the program had no or only short-term effects on these factors." So, this type of intervention didn't really affect how they felt about the behavior, how they perceived the expectations of others to execute the behavior, or whether they had control or self-efficacy over the behavior. The conclusion here is that fear appeals, the primary function of this program, are unlikely to prevent or reduce risky behaviors because it's not affecting all of these other belief factors. We're not affecting self-efficacy, so we are not giving these students the tools they need to actually do what we need them to do. Quote, "Fear appeals may arouse the interest and attention of young people as a kind of door opener, but without strengthening psychosocial beliefs, namely self-efficacy, they seem to be more a flash in the pan." I love it when researchers get idiomatic. Continued. "Thus, the party program seems to be classified in a series of educational measures to change behavior, which produce short-term effects, but for which no behavior-related effects can be proven in the long term." And that, folks, seems like a great place to end this episode. What did we learn? 4 different studies I presented here question the effectiveness of scare tactics as a method of getting people to do what we want them to do. And 3 of them, anyway, have quantitative analysis with sound data to say it's not working the way we intended it to work. So, this has been part 1. In part 2, I'll present the other side, and I'll critically evaluate those studies as well. I hope this has been as thought-provoking as the topic always is for my ethics course students. Now, the question is, where the hell did that study go that gave me that 30 to 60 days number? Until next time, I'm Dr. Matt Law. This has been another episode of Study Finds on the Prove It To Me podcast. Take care and stay safe, everyone. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of the content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.